if I were to ask you what the good old days are for you, I mean, what might come to mind? What era of your life, what era of our world's history, our country's history would come to mind if I say, the good old days? Let's get back to the good old days. What do you think about? Now, if you're like around my age, maybe you would think about the 80s. Come on, let's hear it for the 80s. The 80s were a good time. Maybe that's when you were in high school or you were in college. You just remember good times during the 80s when bands had big hair and long guitar solos, the way it's supposed to be. Or the time before we had these cell phones attached to us and we're like connected to the ball and chain, that innocent era before smartphones. Maybe it's 80s for you. Or if you're older, maybe you think about the 50s or the 60s being the good old days, sock hops and the time, when America still had our supposed innocence, right? Or maybe if you're younger, maybe you think of the good old days as being the time when you had a flip phone. Those are the good old days. When people actually talked on their phone, instead of like doing all this other stuff with their phones. Or maybe for you, the good old days would be the time when we were really making good movies like the Twilight Saga or, the Lord of the Rings trilogy. Those were the good old days for some of you younger folks. I don't know. What do you think about when you think about the good old days? The good old days, it's this cultural cliche that we'll often use that describes a time in the past that is supposedly in some way better than today. And it can refer to a relationship that we're in. Do you remember when we spent time together and we actually got along, like the good old days, right? So the assumption is that things were better in the past, but they're not so good right now. It could refer to a time in our country's history or our past when things seemed more wholesome or more moral. Remember the good old days when people cared about doing what was right and they were compassionate and we cared about each other and we helped each other. The good old days can be a time when things seemed less violent. Do you remember when we can go to that part of town and any time of day we didn't worry about getting mugged or about getting shot, or we didn't worry about mass shootings, the good old days. It could refer to a time when popular music was more to our liking. It could refer to a time when our political party was in power. It could refer to a time when popular clothes were more in line with our particular tastes. The good old days. But have you ever found yourself, maybe even recently, kind of grieving about the loss of the good old days? Have you found yourself grieving over the state of our world, of our country, maybe even of your life, wishing that you can go back to some time in the past when things just seem to be better? As we find ourselves in the midst of this historic campaign for our next president, this seems to be a sentiment that I hear as I talk to people quite a bit, an unsettledness. What's happening with our country? What's happening in our world? And the sentiment comes again and again, oh, if only for the good old days. And so just for the next 2 weeks, I'd like for us just to together kind of process, spend some time together considering what it means to live as followers of Christ in a broken world. Now, we're talking about that every week, but particularly, what role, what responsibilities do we have as followers of Christ, as citizens of this country? We have duties and responsibilities as citizens of this country, but at the same time, as citizens of God's kingdom. You see, living as followers of Jesus in our complex and our broken world can be very complex, very confusing. We're people with dual citizenship, really, if we're followers of Jesus, right? We're citizens of this world, we're citizens of this country, we have responsibilities, but at the same time, we're citizens of God's kingdom, and our ultimate allegiance is to God's values and God's rule and God's reign. And so oftentimes there's a tension. There seems to be a tension. And how do we navigate that tension between this dual citizenship? What does it look like? How do we navigate the complexity? Now, certainly we're not going to be able to answer all those questions in 2 weeks. We're not even going to ask all the questions in the next 2 weeks. But hopefully just get a little perspective as we kind of head into this election season this fall. And we begin with this idea of the good old days. And the question really is, what is our hope as followers of Christ? Or what is our goal? What is our mission? Why are we here? Is it our hope? Is it our mission to somehow, some way reclaim the good old days? Well, this desire to get back to the good old days seems to be as old as history and as old as humanity itself. It's at least 2,500 years old, because that's how old the story is in the Bible we're looking at today. We're going back 2,500 years to a story that's told in the Old Testament book of Ezra. It's found in chapter 3, and so if you have a device or a Bible that you'd like to open to Ezra chapter 3, that's where we'll be. Ezra is this Old Testament scribe. He writes a book, and it's really about rebuilding. For hundreds of years, the Jewish people had lived in Jerusalem. And Jerusalem had become the hub of Jewish life, Jewish culture, Jewish worship. Solomon, hundreds of years before, had built this magnificent, glorious temple in Jerusalem that meant wherever you lived, at least once a year, you were coming to Jerusalem. That was the heart of things. But after hundreds of years of disobedience and rebellion, God finally allowed an ancient nation, the Babylonians, and a Babylonian king named Nebuchadnezzar to come and discipline, to destroy Jerusalem. Now, just a quick side note here. Folks today wonder, as they look at the state of our country, how can God be in any of this? As we look at our elections, maybe I don't know what side of the aisle you're on, but as you look, if this person gets into the presidency, how could God be in that? Or if this person gets in, how could God be in this? Or more often than not, most people say, if either of these people get in, how could God possibly be in this? That's the same thing that they were saying 2,500 years ago when this pagan king, this ruler of a pagan empire, was used by God to discipline God's people. So here we have 2,500, and the prophets at the time, they're scratching their heads. God, how can you do this? How can you use this pagan king over this pagan empire to accomplish your will? But this is the reality. God always has and God always will use whoever he can to accomplish his will in this world. And so as followers of Christ, we could take comfort in that. Even if we don't like what's going on, we don't like who's in power, the Bible makes it clear, no leader is in power unless God puts them there somehow, for some way, to accomplish his purpose. Right? So this is what's happening 2,500 years ago. We've got Nebuchadnezzar, this pagan king, and he's used by God. And in 586 BC, this pagan king tears down the walls of Jerusalem, completely levels the city, and he destroys the Jewish temple. Most people living in Jerusalem at the time were killed in this invasion, but several hundred, maybe several thousand, a handful of Jewish people were taken off into exile to live in Babylon for the next 50 years or so. And then God had prophesied through the prophet Jeremiah. He said, yeah, this is what's going to happen to you because of your disobedience and your rebellion, but after a time, I'm going to send you back to Jerusalem, and you're going to have a second chance. In my compassion, we're going to try this yet again, right? And so, in fulfillment of that prophecy, in the year 537 BC, this is all spelled out historically as well as in the Bible, King Cyrus, the Persian king, in fulfillment of Jeremiah's prophecy, sends the first wave of Jews back to Jerusalem, and he gives them the instruction to rebuild the temple, to reestablish their system of worship. Now, at the time, Ezra is a scribe who returns with that first wave of Jews to begin rebuilding the temple, and he's recording everything that's happening. Now, if you were with us earlier this year and we went through the entire book of Nehemiah, you may wonder, where does Nehemiah fit in? Nehemiah and Ezra were contemporaries. Ezra went back first. He rebuilt the temple. Then Nehemiah would come later to restore and rebuild the walls. But this first wave of Jews gets back to Jerusalem, and all they find is a pile of rubble. I mean, it's just, ravens and crows and vultures. There's nothing. It's just rubble. And so they get to work, and they begin to, with vigor and determination, first they rebuild the altar so they could begin offering sacrifices again. Then they relay the foundation of the temple, just the foundation. And after they had done that, they then stop and they pause for a public kind of worship celebration just to thank God for how far he had brought them so far. This is where we pick up the story. Ezra chapter 3, verse 10. When the builders laid the foundation of the temple of the Lord, the priests in their vestments, in other words, their garb, and with trumpets, and the Levites, the sons of Asaph, with cymbals, took their places to praise the Lord as prescribed by David, king of Israel. So hundreds of years before King David, he was a big worshiper, and he had kind of prescribed how to worship. So talk about getting back to the good old days. Here they are hundreds of years later saying, we're worshiping old style here. This is King David style of worship that we're kind of bringing back to Jerusalem. Verse 11 says, with praise and thanksgiving, they sang to the Lord. He is good. His love to Israel endures forever. And all the people gave a great shout of praise to the Lord because the foundation of the house of the Lord was laid. So here you have this first wave of Jews. They've just come back. Jerusalem's rubble. But they relay the temple's foundation, and they stop and they praise. They have this great shout of celebration because the temple is being rebuilt. But as the celebration goes on, something strange happens in verse 12. But many of the older priests and Levites and family heads who had seen the former temple wept aloud when they saw the foundation of this temple being laid, while many others shouted for joy. No one could distinguish the sound of the shouts of joy from the sound of weeping, because the people made so much noise, and the sound was heard far away. So you got the story, right? So this new foundation is laid for a new temple, and in the midst of this celebrating, those who were older, they're not celebrating. They're grieving. They're weeping. Why? Well, if we just do the math, we can figure this out. Again, the temple had been destroyed in 586 BC. This event is taking place in 536 BC. Only 50 years had passed. And so you had people in this group, this congregation, this first wave of Jews, who were alive when Jerusalem had been destroyed. They maybe were standing in the very same place 50 years ago as the temple burned. They had seen the magnificence and the glory of that original temple. And they looked at what was being built now, this feeble little foundation, not anywhere near as grand as the original temple was. And there they are, and they're saying, "Are you kidding me? This is a disgrace to temples. You should have seen the old temple. We need to get back to the good old days." And they grieve. Things haven't changed much in the last 2,500 years, right? I mean, while the young people celebrate change and progress, the older folks have a tendency to grieve. And often it's because the older we get, the more perspective we have. And as you watch things change from generation to generation, you begin to have the sense of how much is actually changing, and it can be very unsettling. It could cause us to want to go backwards to what once was, the good old days. We do it with issues of morality. Morality of our culture, as we grieve what appears to be an ever-declining moral ethic. We wonder, where are we heading as a culture, as a world? What's happening to our world? Everything seems to be falling apart. No one cares about doing what's right anymore. Or we could look at the violence again in our world and say things like, it just isn't safe to travel anymore. Or I'm not comfortable going out. I'm afraid I'm going to get caught in a mass shooting situation. We do it with politics. Some look at where we are as a nation right now and the political unrest, and we say things like, "Oh, remember the Reagan years. Remember the Reagan years. If we could only go back to that would be great." Or other people are saying, "Man, when President Clinton was in, man, those were good years. We knew what we were getting, and the economy was going great." Let me just say that when it comes to this whole sentiment of looking back to the good old days, I get it. The older I get, the more I get it. Because you really do start to get more and more perspective. You see how things change over time. And if I could just be transparent with you, I remember a time just a few years ago when I went through a very difficult time spiritually, emotionally, as I looked at the things that were happening right here in our very own state. I remember when marijuana was legalized. And I was like, are you kidding me? And the first time I went downtown, I was just surrounded by people smoking pot. It turned out it was 420 day, but it was really bad. I wasn't there for 420 today, but it was, And then around the same time, in Colorado, gay marriage was made legal, and I don't know how you feel about that, but for me, that was just, again, a huge shift. I mean, this is the first time we've redefined marriage since the beginning of humanity. This is monumental, and we just did it without really thinking things through, in my opinion. And then we saw the mass shootings and the violence and racism raging across the country. And I just know for me, I began to feel this sense of anger, of hopelessness, of frustration. What in the world is happening to my home state? Just my home state. And through that time, I spent a lot of time praying and processing and journaling. And I realized during that time, I was really yearning for something maybe that once was. Maybe it was, maybe it wasn't. But I was wanting to go backwards. And while I probably wouldn't have put it this way, I was yearning for the good old days. But there are a few problems with our desire to go back to the good old days. One of the things I realized during that time that really helped me a lot is to realize the darker things get, the brighter light shines, right? And so if our country is indeed sliding morally, that just means that the finest days of the church are before us, right? This is our greatest opportunity. That's how I look at things now. That's helped me a bit. Maybe that'll help you. I don't know. But there's a problem going back to the good old days because, first of all, like the title of Otto Bettman's book, The Good Old Days, they were terrible. We have this selective memory when it comes to the past. We have a tendency to idealize the times that went by. We remember the good of the past, but we seem to kind of forget about all the lousy and messed up stuff that was happening in those same days. For the most part, the good old days really are a myth. They are a figment of our individual or our collective imagination. But a bigger problem with trying to get back to the good old days, especially for a Christ follower, is this. When we look back, we're looking in the wrong direction. For a follower of Christ, when we look back, we're looking in the wrong direction. And certainly we need to remember our past. We need to honor our past. We need to learn from our past. Doesn't mean we forget the past. But when we look to the past, we are looking in the wrong direction. If I'm trying to go backwards, I'm going in the wrong direction. That's not what we are called to. Our calling, our hope, our mission as followers of Christ isn't to restore something that once was or to return to a time gone by. Our hope, our mission it lies in something that is yet to come, that is still unfulfilled. Let's go back to those people 2,500 years ago who are standing there at the newly laid foundation of the temple who are grieving. They're weeping. They're wishing they could have their old temple back. They're looking in the wrong direction. Those people were looking in the wrong direction. Those in Jerusalem shouldn't have been looking back at the old temple because their best days were still ahead of them. The real temple was still to come. Well, what do I mean by that? Well, what was the original purpose of the temple? The purpose of the temple was to be a place where God would dwell among his people. If you remember the very first temple, God was the one who told them to build. Exodus chapter 25, verse 8. He said, have them build me a sanctuary. Have them build me a temple so that I can dwell with them, so that I could be with them. The purpose of the temple was so that God could be there in the midst of his people. And so they shouldn't have been looking at the grandeur of the building and grieving that. They should have been looking forward because just 400 years from this event that we just read about in Ezra 3, the true temple would come. On a silent night in the town of Bethlehem, a baby would be born whose name was Jesus, also known of as Emmanuel, God with us. He referred to himself as the temple of God because the purpose of the temple he was fulfilling. He had come to be with them. And so these people living in 2,500 years ago, they're crying about a temple that had been born, but their best days were still to come. Jesus, the Messiah, the one who would be among his people, had yet to be born. So, in the same way, as followers of Christ today, we need to understand that our hope isn't something that was in the past. Our hope is something that still lays in the future, something yet unfulfilled. Our hope isn't in reforming our culture. As followers of Christ, our mission isn't to return to some ideal political age. It isn't in restoring the morality of a bygone era. No, our greatest hope, the thing that we look forward to more than anything, is what lies ahead, not what lies behind us. Jesus is coming again to be with his people. And when he does, he will make all things right. Those things that we yearn for from the past are good things that God implanted in our hearts that we should yearn for. And all of them will be completely fulfilled. They will become the new eternal norm as soon as Jesus returns. So think about what your heart yearns for. Justice, equality, peace, forgiveness, love, health. You want a good health care plan? Jesus is going to bring it, right? Mutual respect, abundant life, eternal life. All of these are going to become the new eternal norm as soon as Jesus returns. This is our hope. This is what we're waiting for. This is what gives a believer a sense of peace while everyone else in our culture is feeling anxiety. And so I believe Jesus' words 2,000 years ago, the night before he died, they apply now more than ever. I could just imagine Jesus saying, as you look at the state of your world, and as you consider today's political uncertainty, as you think about declining morality, increasing violence, as you see all of this, let not your hearts be troubled. Trust God. Trust me. Jesus said, in my Father's house are many rooms. If it were not so, I would tell you. I am going there to prepare a place for you. And if I go, I will come again so that you can be with me where I am. This is our hope. Jesus is coming again to fulfill every promise of his people. And so as followers of Christ, we don't yearn for the good old days. Our best days are before us. So, as dual citizens, our hope isn't in reforming an immoral culture or in the next president we elect. Our hope is in the coming of our true King and the establishment of his eternal kingdom. That doesn't mean we don't get involved in issues today. It doesn't mean we don't fight against injustice wherever we see it or try to work against systems of sin or violence. This is a topic that we'll turn to next week. But it does mean that we have our hope in the right person, Jesus. And they have it pointed in the right direction, the future. As followers of Christ, we are to remember the past, honor it, learn from it, yet with our firm gaze toward the future. So for the rest of our time together this morning, we have the opportunity just to kind of physically act out this reality. We have the chance to reaffirm our citizenship in God's kingdom through the Lord's Supper. And that's what we do. When we take the Lord's body and blood into us, we are reaffirming where our true citizenship, whose kingdom we're truly a part of, God's kingdom. And we also, during the Lord's Supper, we get to look back at what Jesus did, but more importantly, we look forward to what he promised to do. So, but first, we remember that the way to enter into God's kingdom is through bowing low in service, in humility, and in death to self. That night, 2,000 years ago, when Jesus uttered those words, "Let not your heart be troubled," he had entered into this dinner that he wanted to have with his disciples, and he was going to break the bread and share the cup. But before he did that, they walked into the room, and there was no servant there to wash their feet, as was the custom. They had dirty feet. They wanted to have their feet washed so they could be refreshed to enjoy the meal. Nobody was there, and the disciples, they weren't willing to do it. They all thought that they were above that, or that was below them. They weren't willing to serve one another. They were holding on to themselves still. But Jesus, who knew where he came from and knew where he was going, filled with love, took up a servant's towel and a basin, and he stooped down, and the creator of the universe, the Lord of all things, knelt before those prideful followers, and he washed their feet, demonstrating not only what greatness looks like in his kingdom, but what is essential as citizenship in his kingdom. And then he told them, "You've seen what I've done. You'll be blessed if you do it too." So, we as Seventh-day Adventists, we actually literally, before we take the bread and the wine, we actually literally wash one another's feet because we want that blessing Jesus talked about. We believe that we stoop low to enter into his kingdom. We believe that humility isn't a lesson you learn once and you're good, but we need to keep learning it again and again and again. What does it look like to die to ourselves? So before we take the Lord's body and blood into ourselves, let's prepare ourselves by stooping low, humbling ourselves, serving one another, and actually washing one another's feet. So in a moment, we're going to dismiss. I'm going to ask you, would you be willing just to actually find someone to serve? Maybe not the easiest person to go to. Maybe it's going to be someone you haven't talked to in a while. Maybe someone you don't even know. Maybe it's a guest here with us. You're going to invite them. Can I serve you? And just humble yourself before one another and wash one another's feet. Let me just say, if you are a guest with us today, maybe this is the first or second time you've ever heard of this ever happening, and you're just really? They're going to actually do this? Isn't like a metaphor? Maybe you want to just sit and observe today, and that's totally fine. You could just sit. If someone asks you, just say, "Hey, I'm just going to observe today." But let me just say, if you've been coming for a while, maybe this is your 5th or 6th time that you've seen this, and you're planning on bowing out, let me just say that the very reason that is keeping you from saying yes is the very lesson you need to learn through this experience. That's the beauty of this. If we're honest with ourselves, the thing that keeps us from saying yes is pride. No one's going to wash my feet, or I'm not going to wash someone else's feet. The very lesson we need to learn is humility. So the very thing that keeps us from saying yes is the very lesson we need to learn through the acts. Let me encourage you maybe to step outside your comfort zone today and say, you know what? I'm going to bow myself low. I'm going to humble myself. I'm going to die to self today, and I'm going to do this as I prepare to take the Lord's body and blood. And Jesus promised, you'll be blessed if you do. Let me pray. Father in heaven, Lord God, we thank you that you are a God that has a plan, that you are going to establish your kingdom, that your true, just, perfect, loving, merciful, compassionate kingdom will come, is coming, even now. We are a part of it now, but will come in all of its fullness when we see Jesus face to face. May our eyes be firmly fixed on the future as we learn from the past. Propel us, God, into the future. And now, as we prepare to just reaffirm our citizenship in your kingdom by taking Jesus' body and blood into us, as we prepare our hearts through service, Lord, humble us as we serve one another. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen.